first glance, the trench knife doesn't look like a weapon that would change anything. It's short, compact, almost modest. No long blade, no mechanical complexity, nothing that screams power. In a world of rifles, artillery, and machines built for distance, the trench knife feels almost out of place. Too small, too quiet, too personal. Many soldiers didn't even think of it as important. It didn't win battles. It didn't appear in headlines. It wasn't something you showed off. Most of the time, it stayed hidden, clipped to a belt, tucked into a pack, or resting at the bottom of a pocket, forgotten until it wasn't. But that's exactly what made it matter. During World War II, American soldiers carried many tools: radios, maps, letters from home. The trench knife belonged to a different category entirely. It wasn't about dominance or destruction. It was about presence, about knowing that even when everything else failed, something remained within reach. The trench knife didn't promise victory. It promised composure. Its power wasn't in what it could do, but in what it represented: a final boundary, a quiet reassurance that no matter how chaotic the moment became, the individual was not entirely helpless. To the outside world, it looked ordinary, even unimpressive. But to the person carrying it, the trench knife carried weight far beyond its size. And in wartime, that kind of weight could steady a human mind in ways no machine ever could. Most American soldiers in World War II never expected to use a trench knife. That might sound strange. Why carry something you hope you'll never need? But war is not built on expectations. It's built on uncertainty. Rifles jam, ammunition runs out, radios fail, orders dissolve into noise. In the chaos of combat, distance collapses faster than anyone plans for. What begins as a fight measured in yards can end in inches. The trench knife existed for that collapse, not as a primary weapon, but as a psychological anchor. For many soldiers, carrying a trench knife wasn't about aggression, it was about control, a way to reclaim a sense of agency in an environment designed to strip it away. When everything else depended on systems, supply lines, and commands, the trench knife belonged to the individual alone. It required no coordination, no permission, no explanation, just presence. Veterans later recalled that simply knowing the knife was there changed how they moved, how they breathed, how they endured fear. It was never about wanting to fight closer. It was about not feeling cornered by distance or equipment failure. The knife sat quietly, reminding its owner of something fundamental: you are still responsible for yourself. In military psychology, this matters more than firepower. A soldier who believes he has no final option is a soldier already under siege by fear. The trench knife offered a last psychological line, not to cross eagerly, but to know existed. It wasn't a tool of confidence, it was a tool of steadiness. And in World War II, steadiness kept men alive far more often than bravado ever did. 140 WAD. The trench knife did not originate in World War II. Its story began decades earlier, in a war defined by mud, wire, and claustrophobia, World War I. In the trenches of Europe, distance disappeared. Rifles were long, bayonets were awkward. In the narrow confines of trench lines, soldiers needed something simpler, quieter, something that could exist in a space where movement was limited and reactions had to be immediate. That need gave birth to the trench knife. It wasn't designed for glory. It was designed for survival in spaces where traditional warfare broke down. The knife became a response to proximity, a tool shaped by the reality that sometimes war stopped being about strategy and became about seconds. When World War II began, warfare had changed. Tanks replaced trenches. Air power reshaped battlefields. Technology promised distance again. But the human element hadn't changed. American military planners understood this. They knew that no matter how advanced warfare became, moments of closeness, confusion, darkness, silence would still exist, and when they did, soldiers would revert to the same instincts their predecessors had relied on. The trench knife crossed wars not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. It acknowledged a truth military doctrine rarely liked to admit, that war could still become personal. By World War II, the trench knife was no longer a frontline necessity. It was a contingency, a relic carried forward not because history demanded it, but because psychology did. It reminded soldiers that behind every formation, every strategy, every command, there was still a human being navigating fear at arm's length. And some lessons, once learned in blood and mud, are never truly unlearned. In World War II, survival didn't only depend on what happened in combat, it depended on what happened after. Night was often worse than the battlefield. In the dark, imagination took over. Sounds became threats. Silence became suspicious. A snapping branch, a distant footstep, even the wind could pull the mind back into readiness. Soldiers learned quickly that fear didn't turn off when the fighting stopped. This is where the trench knife took on a different role. Many soldiers kept it close while sleeping, not because they expected an attack, but because it created a sense of boundary, a small, personal perimeter in a world where borders constantly shifted. The knife became part of a nighttime ritual. Check gear, adjust boots, touch the knife, breathe. That touch mattered. Psychologists later recognized this behavior as grounding, a way to anchor the mind to something tangible when control feels fragile. The trench knife wasn't reassurance that nothing would happen, it was reassurance that if something did, the soldier would not wake up empty-handed. For men far from home, surrounded by uncertainty, the knife quietly replaced familiar comforts. It became a substitute for the things left behind. A door that locked, a light that stayed on, a presence that didn't ask questions. It didn't stop fear, it contained it. In a war that demanded constant alertness, the trench knife allowed something rare, moments of rest. And sometimes, rest was the most valuable weapon a soldier had. After World War II, the trench knife quietly faded from standard military gear. There was no announcement, no official farewell. It simply stopped being issued. On paper, the reasons were practical. Warfare was changing. Engagement distances increased. Firearms became more reliable. Training emphasized coordination, not last resort tools. Modern armies wanted efficiency, not improvisation. But the real reason ran deeper. The trench knife belonged to a kind of war the world wanted to leave behind, a war of closeness, uncertainty, and individual survival. Post-war doctrine preferred clarity, lines, systems, control. The knife reminded people of something uncomfortable, that even in a modern army, chaos could still collapse everything down to a single human moment. So it was slowly removed, not because it failed, but because it symbolized vulnerability. Yet the soldiers who carried it didn't forget. Many kept their trench knives long after the war ended, not as weapons, but as objects of memory. They represented nights survived, fear endured, identity held together when everything else felt unstable. In museums today, trench knives sit behind glass, clean, silent, neutralized. But for those who understand, they still carry a message. They remind us that war is not only fought with machines, it is carried inside the human nervous system. And some tools exist not to be used, but to help a person endure the unthinkable. Even after it disappeared from military issue lists, the trench knife never truly left. It resurfaced in memory, in films, in photographs, in stories passed quietly from veterans to their children, not as a weapon in motion, but as an image, a silhouette, a symbol. Hollywood understood this early. When filmmakers wanted to show a soldier as vulnerable, they didn't reach for artillery or uniforms. They showed the small things: hands, breath, proximity, and sometimes, resting near those details, a knife. The trench knife became shorthand for something deeper, the moment when war stopped being abstract and became personal. Collectors later sought these knives not for their function, but for their weight. Each one felt like it had absorbed something intangible: fear, resolve, endurance. Owning one wasn't about possession, it was about proximity to history. In psychology, this is called an artifact of meaning, an object that carries emotional residue beyond its physical form. The trench knife became one of those artifacts. It told a story without speaking. It invited reflection instead of action. In a world increasingly dominated by remote warfare and digital distance, the trench knife stands in contrast. It reminds us that once, survival depended not on screens or systems, but on the human body and mind working together under pressure. That reminder is uncomfortable, and that's why the symbol endures. The trench knife was never meant to be used often. Its true purpose was quieter. In World War II, it represented something rare in modern warfare, a reminder of the individual. Amid formations, commands, and machinery, it stood for the idea that survival ultimately came down to a human being facing fear in real time. The knife didn't make soldiers braver, it made fear manageable. It gave shape to something invisible, the need for a final sense of agency when control felt distant. In that way, the trench knife was less a weapon and more a psychological companion. When wars are remembered, history often focuses on victories, strategies, and machines, but wars are lived through moments: long nights, unanswered questions, the quiet struggle to hold oneself together. The trench knife belonged to those moments. Today, it rests behind glass or in collections, stripped of context. But its meaning hasn't changed. It still asks the same question it once answered for soldiers. What do you hold on to when everything else feels out of reach? For the men who carried it, the trench knife was an answer, not of violence, but of endurance. And sometimes, endurance is the most human weapon of all.